And now, the lowdown with economist and political strategist Elson Lowe.
Good evening, and welcome to the Lowdown. I am your host, Elson Lowe. Thank you for joining us here on a Saturday night. Folks, share the link. Let's bring everyone in. Let's give everyone a chance to see the show. Share the link. Let's get everyone in. It's good to be here. It's always good to have a chat with you guys. Tonight on Saturdays and on Tuesdays, we've got the lowdown on 2 days, Saturday nights and then Tuesday nights. Saturday nights we go into a little bit more depth on issues, whereas Tuesday nights we talk a bit more about the issues that have come up over the course of the week. So thank you for tuning in. Welcome to the lowdown. You know, we've always got an interesting show for you tonight, guys. You know, we've always got an interesting take on the issues. We'll help you to understand how Guyana's economy is changing, how you can position yourself, what the policies of the PNCR are, and how they will benefit you, and what it is that we think really should be improved upon about what's going on right now in the country's governance. So share the link, folks. Share the link. Let's give everyone a chance to see the program. Thank you for joining me here on the Lowdown. Thank you for starting your Saturday night on a high here with Elson Lowe. It's always good to be on. It's always fun to be here with you guys. Share the link. Let's get this show on the road. It's always good to be here. So we're going to talk tonight about a couple of different areas, but they're really linked to one thing, and then we'll talk about an additional one. We're going to talk a bit tonight about debt, both personal debt and national debt. And it is something that has actually touched on a few issues lately in the country that I think needs to be brought to the public attention and that people need to keep an eye on. Now, as someone who worked at a major financial institution before, I have a good understanding of finance and debt and how these things work. And there are some warning signs that I see that are a little bit concerning going forward. I'll also give you an idea of how we are thinking about things a little bit differently in the PNCR and how that informs some of our policies. So we're going to talk a bit about debt. We're going to talk a bit about some of the debt that the government seems to be encouraging people to get into. We're going to talk a bit about the national debt and the way that the government might not be using the national debt in the way that it really should be used, or leveraging debt the way that it should be leveraged. And we're going to talk about student debt. Of course, some of you may recall that we've said that we will cancel all student loans once we are in office, and that we will repay those who paid in cash once they're resident in Guyana. So essentially, the University of Guyana is free right now and will be free going forward. So that is also related to the question of debt. It's different angles, but it's the same theme. And then lastly, we'll just touch on something that I think is interesting, if we have time, of course, which is this question of what's going on with a bit of Guyana's auditing of the oil and gas expenses. You may note that in today's Kaicho, there's an article where I make some comments regarding this. And I just wanted to bring up some more texture on that issue to close off the show if we have a little bit of time. But yes, tonight we're going to be talking about debt, different forms of debt. Debt that's related to the country as a whole, debt that's related to if you're taking out a mortgage, student debt that we have decided that we're going to write off. We're going to give you a perspective on all these issues because they are tremendously important. Going forward in Guyana, we've got a country that's growing rapidly. We've got incomes in some areas, some individuals, some slivers of society that are growing rapidly. But we've not seen incomes grow across the society. So it's something that we have to take a look at and think about. The other thing that I think is really important to get a sense of is, and recall that I've mentioned that we have to know oil the way that we knew gaisuco. We have to know oil the way that we knew sugar. We have to know oil the way that we knew bauxite. We have to know it in detail. We have to get a good understanding of it. And one of the most important characteristics that you'll find about oil, one of the most worrisome characteristics that you'll find is extreme volatility. Prices go up, prices come down. There's a possibility, or at least there's a warning, that if the sanctions on Russian oil go into place at the end of this year, the oil price will spike to 380 or something crazy like that. But we've also seen, I mean, you may say 380 is crazy, but we saw during the pandemic oil prices reach negative numbers, which I don't think anyone had ever imagined would be possible. And I can give you an idea of how that happened. But that therefore indicates that oil is a very volatile commodity, which means that a lot of caution, a lot of thoughtfulness must go into the way that you structure your government budget to deal with it. It's not the same as if we had a robust technology or industrial sector to fund every government budget, but rather, because we're dealing with something that's very volatile, we have to rethink our approach when it comes to how we spend, how we use debt, and so on. If we don't practice the right approaches, then we can find ourselves in a lot of trouble. And I'll give you an idea of some of the troubles that Venezuela faced as a result, of not managing their debt well, as a result of not managing their cash flows and their oil revenues well. Recall, Venezuela has the most oil reserves of any country in the entire world. So we're going to get into all of that. Folks, share the link. Let's give everyone a chance to be on the show. Let's give everyone a chance to see the show. We're going to be touching on some interesting issues, debt, different elements of that, national, private, as well as debt connected to student loans. We've seen President Biden forgive, or his plan to forgive student debt up to, I think, 20,000 for some borrowers and so on, 20,000 US. So there are various things that are in the atmosphere around debt and its impact on things. And while maybe some people might not be as familiar with some of these ideas, it's important that we understand them. Just the same as we understand that Gaisuko, it costs more to produce sugar than Gaisuko actually gets in terms of its returns, just as much as we are fully aware of those types of things. We have to have a good grasp of some of the components, some of the things that are related to the oil and gas economy, and what they mean for what we're seeing in our country right now, and what they mean for some of the PNCR policies, because it is important to get a real sense of the thinking and of the mistakes that are being made right now. So we're going to have, I think, a conversation that is very useful and that will help you to see some of the mistakes that are being made that are a bit worrisome and that we intend to correct in our policy making. So, folks, without further ado, we're going to lean into some of these topic areas. We're going to lean into them. Thanks for joining. Thanks always for joining. It's good to have you. Good to have you with us. We always like to have a little bit of fun here on the Lowdown, and we're going to jump into something I find to be pretty entertaining. So let's get the first slide up. Okay, so we've got essentially the government saying that they're going to assist with homes for some people in hinterland areas, 600 people in Region 9. And they're going to get $1 million from the government to build their homes. So very substantial amount of funds. In addition to this, however, the government is going to be working along with a local bank to provide funding for the rest of their homes, which is an additional $2 million. So the total cost will be $3 million for these homes. So people will get $1 million from the government to build, and then they'll be able to borrow an additional $2 million to build. Now, it may not jump out at you right away, viewers, but I just wanted to point something out gently. Which house in Guyana cost $3 million to build? Interesting. That's kind of strange. And you may say, I don't know how much a house costs to build. But let's jump across to the next slide, and we'll get some perspective here. Okay, so here we've got some information from Ministry of Housing, where it says that some of the low-income houses, right? So low-income housing, you can see the house there. It's a one-bedroom house. It's quite small. I believe it's a one-bedroom house. Quite small, 20 foot by 20 foot, so very small. And this cost $4 million to build. Okay. Now this is being built by the government, so it doesn't account for any profit or anything to that effect. $4 million to build. Very small house. So already, that small house is 30% more expensive to build than the $3 million that they're providing. So my question is, how small of a house are they asking people in the Native in the Amerindian community to build? Who can build a house for $3 million? So is it that people in Region 9 are not entitled to have a sizable house that they could house many of their family members? Is it that they have to live in a shack? That's why the government is only giving them a $3 million allowance here? That's very interesting. But the other question that I have to ask, which perhaps is not clear right away, is if they're not, if this $3 million can't actually build a home, does that mean that people won't build homes with this $3 million? Okay, let's circle back to that. Let's get the next slide up as we continue this discussion. So of course, people may want to build a 2-bedroom, not just a 1-bedroom. And since it's 600 people that they're talking about, I'm sure there's many people that will want to build a 2-bedroom. Now, the Central Housing and Planning Authority, this is another estimate we're getting from a government initiative, where we have 2-bedroom houses, so slightly larger, 20 by 30 feet, okay, that will be built at 5.5 million. 5.5 million. So that is much, much more than the $3 million. Much more than the $3 million. Nearly double. And that's for a 2-bedroom. So if you wanted to get a 2-bedroom as someone living in Region 9, you would be short by $2.5 million. You would have you would have way less money than you needed to build your house. So the question, first of all, must be asked, what type of houses are they looking for people to build in Region 9? Two, is it that people in that region can't expect to have a 2-bedroom house? That's not within the government's plans. And then three, I could be wrong, but I was under the impression that building materials and so on are often quite expensive in the interior regions of Guyana. So $3 million is probably not going to be worth anywhere near what it would be worth at the coast. We have easy access to concrete and to steel and to finished hardwoods and to paint and a lot of these other things. The prices in the interior are often, typically really, much higher than prices on the coast. Now it could be that the Amerindian people in the area or other people in the area will be using local materials. Maybe they're going to be building their houses exclusively of wood. That's a possibility. But it seems strange to me that you would only offer $3 million to build a home, only $3 million to build a home, when the cheapest home that the government normally builds is $4 million. And a reasonable 2-bedroom home, which is really what I think most people would aim for, is way more expensive, almost double the cost. So what exactly is this $3 million supposed to do? But we started this show by talking about debt. So we've got the government fronting $1 million towards us. So, but the people in that community will have to borrow $2 million. Now, if it is that this money is not enough for them to actually build their home, and they borrow the $2 million, then they won't be able to build a home. It's not enough. But they've still taken out the loan. And so what that means is that they'll still have to pay back that loan, pay back the interest, pay back the loan, all of that, because they took out the funds. So they don't get a house. So they can't, let's say they're renting, they can't get rid of their rent expense. They still have to pay the rent expense. Plus they have an additional, I think it's $14,000 a month they'll be paying. They have an additional amount that they'll be paying now to the bank. And maybe they'll invest this $3 million in something else. I don't know. Maybe they'll spend it wisely. But then again, maybe not. And as a result, what may occur, if this does not flow the way that it really should, what may occur is that people accumulate a lot of debt without actually having a higher income. So you have more debt, but you don't have a higher income. And what does that mean? It means that the risks that people are taking on are increasing. The risks that you have, the amount of money you owe the bank, that risk, your ability to repay, that's in question. And so what I would say to the government is, if you want to provide relief and so on, provide the amount that people require to actually build their homes and not a bare minimum amount that may not even be able to build someone's home and may put them in a precarious situation because they accumulate debt. So very interesting plan by the government here. I don't know how they came to a $3 million figure, but I cannot understand that that figure is below the $4 million that is normally charged for a low-income home. And viewers, to put the cherry on the cake, viewers, to give you another angle on this whole thing, you know that because of the pandemic and because of the war in Ukraine, the price of building materials has gone up. This $4 million estimate I gave you is not an estimate from yesterday. This is an estimate from a while back. So the houses should be more expensive to build even now. Folks, you sometimes you have to ask yourself what exactly the government is doing, where these plans are coming from, who is assessing these, who's coming up with these plans, and how is this working? This makes no sense. But more broadly, we've talked about the housing crisis in Guyana. We've talked about the shift in housing and the need for more housing because of the oil and gas industry's effects and so on. We've talked about how many people will be displaced as the oil and gas industry brings in higher earning workers. We talked about that extensively. But some of the government's initiatives to combat this raise a few questions. One, they've worked with the banks to lower interest rates, or at least they say that they've worked with the banks to lower interest rates and so on. And while that is good because we want Guyanese to be able to get access to housing, I believe they've also lowered the amounts that you don't have to pay any upfront deposit. It's good we want Guyanese to get access to housing, but first of all, if you don't have to pay an upfront deposit, the reason that there's an upfront deposit is to cover the bank's risks. So if you're going to allow people who cannot pay an upfront deposit to borrow, then they may not be able to repay the loan in the first place. That's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, it's good that you have a low interest rate, but you're now introducing people into the system who, again, may not really have had the capacity to repay. Of course, as the economy grows, we want to see incomes rise, and therefore people's capacity to repay increase. Okay? That's what the expectation is. So the optimistic scenario, the scenario that we would all want, is that Guyanese earn more, are able to take out loans, are able to get their own homes, and are able to live comfortably. However, as we always say on this show, oil is a funny man, and it can lead to making things better, or it can lead to making things worse. And you may say to yourself, how could that be? But we've already highlighted that there's been a cost of living effect by the changes in the economy partially brought about by the oil and gas industry, and that is something that's not fully been addressed by the government. We've seen costs of living going through the roof and continue to go through the roof in a wide range of areas here in Guyana. But we've also seen wages in the country really be quite stagnant. In fact, it's only recently the government raised the minimum wage, which was stagnant for several years, and it is still only $60,000 a month. So wages have been quite low. And in fact, the country has been growing quickly, 60% this year, unbelievable. But have wages grown 60% this year? No. But there are industries and areas and slices of the population where you've seen salaries go up and so on. So there's specific sectors where people are doing well, but the broader population is not benefiting from this tremendous growth right now. And so while in theory it sounds good to lend people money to get their homes, if you don't actually have an increase across the broad population of income, then what may be happening is that the level of risk in the country is going up because people are now getting access who may not be able to actually repay these loans. That's the question you have to ask yourself. So, of course, we want to focus on housing. We want to get people to get a chance to have home ownership. But we do have to ask some questions around this. And one of the questions that I would ask is, why aren't we giving people larger grants towards building their homes rather than asking them to take out these large loans to build their homes? Because what is going on is the country's income is growing, right? The country's GDP, the country's income, the amount of oil money we're getting, that's growing. But the income of people on the ground is not growing. So we need to find ways to redistribute some of that income, which is concentrated in the government's hands across the economy to ensure that everyone can benefit as the economy grows, as the society grows. So this to me seems to be the government misunderstanding really the problem in the society and actually increasing the risks to the society while not increasing actually increasing the risks to the society. And you may say, oh, well, there's nothing to worry about. That's a crazy notion. Things are going well. People will be able to repay their mortgages. It doesn't matter what the interest rate is. But before the financial crisis in the U.S., one of the things that caused it is that the government made an effort to help people to get access to housing and loans and so on, who may not really have been able to repay. And that created a housing bubble, and that's how the financial crisis began with subprime mortgages and so on and so forth. So there's something to be a little bit concerned about here. We've also not seen the government raise public servant salaries, not seen them give out substantial, continuous, regular cash grants the way that we've talked about, the PNCR has talked about. So what has happened is you've not seen incomes rise across the country, but you're now seeing people take on more debt. This is quite a bit concerning. This is very concerning. That's one side of it. The other side of it is for those people who can't access debt, who maybe have I know a lot of people owe various various places around town, whether you buy a fridge on credit, you buy a TV on credit, and so on, and then maybe you're not able to repay, and now your credit is in a shambles. So you can't access loans and financing. So that also freezes some people out of the system. I think that this reflects really a misunderstanding of the nature and of the economy, of the structure of the economy, of the changes that we're seeing, of the massive growth and the massive income coming into the country. So I think there's really kind of the government has a real disconnect in terms of how it is operating, a real disconnect. And I'll give you another example that I find to be interesting and that maybe is not immediately obvious. But the government has made an effort to spend all of the resources that is in the natural resources fund. So right away, they said they're going to spend all of it. More is coming in this year. They're going to spend it. Now, what I find to be interesting about this is because they've made the decision to spend all of that, and because they're expected to continue to spend at that rate in future years, if there's an oil price shock, let's say that there's a new strain of COVID that comes out, and the oil price drops right down again, maybe even to negative territory, because the government would have spent and is already spending all of the funds in the natural resources fund and so on, the government may only be able to continue spending at this rate for about a year before it comes across very serious problems. And so what could happen is next year's budget continues around 500 and something billion, everything is good. But then the following year's budget could drop to be about 400 billion or 300 billion. So drop right back. And that would cause a shock to the economy and an immediate recession. Seems crazy, right? That could never happen. Things are going well. How could you be thinking about it in this way? Well, folks, that is exactly what happened in Venezuela, which is that there was an oil price shock. The oil price stayed low for a couple of years, and the Venezuelans were not able to balance their budgets. So I think sometimes things that off the top of your head sounds, oh, just spend the cash, don't borrow money internationally, spend the cash, focus on that. It can sound good, but that's only if you're not super clear on the fact that you have a specific type of economy. If we had an economy that had a big industrial base or technology oriented, where we have regular money coming in and the industry is not volatile, we can approach that in a different way. But because we have an economy that is dependent upon something which is extremely, extremely volatile, we have to be thoughtful and cautious in the way that we approach things. And it may not seem to make sense right off the bat. But actually what we should do is while the oil price is high, we should borrow, keep our cash so that we have cash to pay back these debts, so that if there's a shock and the oil price falls, we will have enough cash both to continue to repay our debts and to be able to stabilize the economy over the course of several years until the oil price comes back to a reasonable level. Because Venezuela did not have that cash on hand to stabilize the economy for a good period of years, they ended up with a very severe recession. They ended up with people losing jobs, the average Venezuelan moving from eating 3 meals a day to 2 meals a day, to widespread crime. It was very severe. In fact, the recession in Venezuela, the crash in Venezuela, was the worst economic crash of any country that was not actively involved in a war. So yes, in the course of a war, everything stopped. It's a big economic crash. But what happened in Venezuela was as bad as it has ever gotten outside of an actual war. So the management of oil resources is really something that has to be done thoughtfully, and I don't think the government has been thoughtful at all. Now, one of the reasons that I can speak with authority on this is that I was at Goldman Sachs during the period when Venezuela was really strapped for cash and they took a loan at Goldman Sachs. So I was able to see firsthand what was going on, what the dynamics were, where Venezuela went wrong, and how they ended up in that situation. In fact, it got so bad that at one point the Chinese government was unwilling to lend Venezuela any more funds because there were some concerns around Venezuela there, so they were unwilling to lend them more. The Russians decided to continue to lend them, and I believe that Venezuela actually had to put up as collateral some of their offshore oil blocks. So that's how bad it got. It may seem intuitive, it may seem to make sense. So you've got cash coming in, spend your cash. Don't be borrowing money to spend. But because of the type of economy you have, that is not always that is really, I don't think, the correct way to approach it. And of course, you may say, if you're borrowing now, surely if there's an oil price shock, if there's a drop in the oil price and you need to borrow some money, you can just borrow then. What's the big deal? What's the big problem, Elson? If the government is unable to get oil revenues in, surely we can argue that oil revenues will come back later on. So we can just borrow and everything will be fine. But the problem is, of course, when the oil price is low, nobody wants to lend to you, right? The risk is high. There's a possibility that the oil price will never come back up. So there's a lot of risk. So it's much more difficult for you to borrow. Then the cost of you borrowing is much higher, and you end up in a real pickle. And I say that may sound pie in the sky, it may sound like an academic argument, but that is exactly what happened next door that caused Venezuela to be in a crisis. So the government is essentially managing the economy in exactly the same way that the Venezuelans manage their economy. And I'll throw you something else that should help to give you some perspective on this. You know that Venezuela has a sovereign wealth fund? You know what's in that sovereign wealth fund? Not much. So essentially, the government is draining the sovereign wealth fund in the same way that they drain the sovereign wealth fund in Venezuela. Folks, you can't make this up. You can't make this up. That is what is going on. It is, as I've said on this show, I have a dark sense of humor. And I find this to be hilarious. It is hilarious. Because what will happen is, if there's a shock to the oil price tomorrow and this shock lasts a couple of years, it's going to be problems. And it's so obvious, but that's what's exactly how it is being dealt with. uh, the government, the PVP is being very, very amateurish, and they're not really familiar with how to operate an oil economy. They have no idea how to operate an oil economy. In fact, they've actually been shrinking Guyana's external debt when they should be expanding Guyana's external debt, or not. They've not been expanding the external debt the way that they should be. So the long and short of it is that Guyana is now, relative to where it was before, vulnerable to an oil price shock. Now, these shocks, COVID, only lasted about a little bit less than a year. But the oil price shock that happened when there was the Saudis kept the oil price, or allegedly kept the oil price low for several years, that shock lasted for a long time, and that's why Venezuela was really unable to pay its debts, unable to keep its government services going, and so on. Now, that's the big picture of what we should be worried about in this country. That's the big picture of it. But on a small level, the average citizen level, we've talked a bit about people borrowing money now to get homes and so on. We've talked about people in Region 9 borrowing money to get homes. But now that they've accumulated more debt, their incomes haven't necessarily risen. Let's suppose that you do get that oil price shock and that the economy jumps into a recession, people start to lose jobs, things start to shut down. Guess what's going to happen to those same people who borrowed money? They're going to have not be able to repay the loans, and they're going to be foreclosed on, and they're going to lose the houses. All these things are connected. How do I know? Because this is what has happened in other countries. The evidence is there, it's pretty clear. This is I think what happens when you have a government that has no real sense of how to manage these resources well. How to manage these resources well. And in the course of all of this, inequality is going through the roof. So people's salaries are not really increasing in the country. A small segment of the society is making lots of money and doing well, and the gap between the two is growing. This is something that can easily be avoided if the government refocuses, reprioritizes, and has a structure to how it operates. Can easily be addressed. We have spoken in PNCR about salary top-ups. We've spoken about removing income tax for lower income earners. We've spoken about student stipends. We've spoken about writing off student debt. We're going to get to that in a minute. We've spoken about all of these things. But why have we been talking about them? We've been talking about them because we recognize that we have to govern an oil economy in a different way than we would govern other types of economies. Inequality is a very serious issue in this country, and it will continue to be a serious issue because most of the revenues, the gains, are concentrated in the government coffers, in the government hands from the oil revenues, and the entire society will not necessarily benefit. So the government has to think about how to structure things so that people benefit, but so that we also grow the non-oil economy, so that we also expand people's ability to earn more, so that we also build out these industries and fight inequality. It requires a different approach. And something as simple as PP focusing on giving people more loans, something as simple as that reflects, I think, a real misunderstanding of the way to manage the economy, a real misunderstanding. We have a good assessment of it. As I indicated to you, I was there when those loans were taken out from Venezuela, took out that loan with Goldman Sachs. I sat and I examined the situation. I had a first-hand view of it. And as a result, I can bring those insights to what is happening right now in Guyana. So to some it may seem, oh, it's good, they're not borrowing certain things, they're spending all the money, they're spending the cash, but that does not reflect a good understanding of the nature of an oil and gas economy, where oil is very, very volatile and pretty much anything can happen. There could be a new variant of COVID tomorrow, and the oil price could drop right down to negative territory. It could happen. That's what happened before. So we would, of course, not want that at all. But we have to be aware of that. And so even on an individual level in Guyana, we have to start thinking about ourselves and start thinking about our economy as being an oil economy. We have to understand what that means and how we should govern it in ways that are different than other types of economy. If we had a big technology sector like some countries, where the technology sector grows and is relatively stable, it would be entirely different. We would have to look at entirely different policies. We've got to assess our economy and assess what we need to do to grow the non-oil sectors as well as manage the oil sector. That is really critical. And right now, oil is 60% of exports at the last check. So it's already really taking off. That is what is going on. And again, just the way that we understand Gaisuka, just the way we understand bauxite, just the way that we understand rice, we have to understand oil on that level. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in problems in the same way that the Venezuelans found themselves in some very serious problems. We've got a quick 5-minute video we're going to put up here to change the conversation. We're going to talk a bit about another area of debt. And this area of debt has to do with student loans. Student loans. And of course, we have said the University of Guyana, we're going to cancel all of that student loan debt. It is a travesty. It is a sin that people have had to pay for that university. And we're going to compensate those who paid in cash once they're resident in Guyana. So that's the commitment that we have made. Now, we're going to talk a bit about the student loan, the debt cancellation in the US, which Biden has recently announced that that's something that they're pushing for. To give you a perspective that it's not just in Guyana that this is happening. It's not just a policy that we have, but it's something that's considered as a good thing in many parts of the world. So let's get that video up, and then we'll talk again on the other side of it.
This is near and dear to me. I am a professor at Morgan State University. My students are affected by these loans. We live in a country that's just about to send $750 million additional dollars to help Ukraine. So I don't really get these arguments about fairness. But what do you think of what President Biden just said in response to the question of, hey, whether or not it's fair to be handing out these small loans and loan forgiveness?
Well, I think what he said was absolutely right. I mean, what we've seen since 1980 is the ballooning of the cost for college and all of the sort of ways in which aid and loans have not caught up to it. And at the same time, we've seen Republican administration after administration give huge tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans. We've seen corporations be bailed out, whether it's the banks or other businesses. And we've seen everyday people struggling just to be able to keep up in this economy and to be able to gain the type of education that will help our country move forward. We've also seen the ways in which all of this has has widened the wealth gap and has made it much harder for people to be able to have sort of a foothold for a future. And so we recognize that this is a huge step forward. We do not think it's enough, especially given how much has been given to the wealthiest Americans, how much has been forgiven for major corporations for their own misdeeds and their own mistakes. But this is a step forward. We should celebrate it, and then we should double down and fight for more.
Yeah, I mean, look, if our country can bail out a bunch of private banks, I don't see why they can't cancel loans that aren't just from the federal government, from private organizations as well. Andrew, my question for you is, like I said, I use my students as a focus group, and I talked to them in Thursday's class about, hey, what do you guys think of the loan forgiveness? About a third of them were like, I don't know, Dr. Johnson, I don't really think this is enough. Some were like, hey, I'll take your $10,000 if you want to hand it to me. My question for you is, do you think this is actually getting out to the right people? Because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Do you think young people are getting the message, hey, if you're graduating next couple of years, if you've recently graduated, here's an opportunity for you? Is it going to get to the kinds of people who are going to be voting this fall?
I think so. I think people are getting the message. We've already seen on the site a 76% increase in voter registration in states like Georgia. Georgia notably has one of the highest student debt loads in the country. So I think that young people are connecting the dots between the elections that are coming up and the issues they really care about. Across the country, we're also seeing about an 11% spike overall in youth registrations. So yes, I think they care about issues like student debt, about the Dobbs decision, and I think the message is getting through and people are looking to show up and have their voice heard.
Okay, folks, thank you for staying with us for that few minutes that we had a video there. I wanted to point out a couple of things that are really important. First, as we mentioned, we're not the only ones that are looking at students at loan relief, at debt write-offs. It's something that has been discussed a lot in the States and something that President Biden is pushing for. But one of the things that I think is actually quite interesting and mirrors what's going on in Guyana is the question of inequality. What they're saying is they believe that because the cost of college has increased so much, it's actually been a burden and created some inequality between previous generations and current generations. Well, I would put it to you this way. We have a very similar thing in Guyana right now. Very similar thing. And is it that the cost of UG has gone up? No, UG's costs have not gone up exponentially the way that they have in the US, or at least I don't think they've gone up that much. But if UG used to be free, and then all of a sudden UG has a big cost, then that is a big jump in the cost of getting a college degree in Guyana, a big jump. And of course, UG used to be free. So what you've got is that previous generations did not have to pay for their education, but younger generations have had to pay. And that has created a gap in between the generations in terms of their wealth. And that is now another form of inequality because previous generations benefited and the current generations did not. So the mere fact that people have had to take out loans and had to pay the University of Guyana has created inequality in the society, intergenerational inequality. We have said that we're going to fight inequality as a party. The opposite side of the aisle, PP, has said that has not indicated inequality is one of their priorities. We have said that we want to fight inequality. This is another form of inequality, inequality between age groups. And I always found it to be quite frustrating when I was fighting for free UG before becoming a part of the opposition that, people who had gotten University of Guyana degrees for free were sometimes staunchly against young people getting University of Guyana degrees for free. And I thought that that was the most ridiculous thing in the world. We recognize that charging for the University of Guyana is a historic sin, and we have decided to put it right. We must give credit to the leader of the PNCR for taking this bold step. Comrade Aubrey Norton has taken a very bold step in saying we're going to get rid, first of all, of tuition, second of all, of debt, and we're going to help those who paid in cash who are resident in Guyana. This is a very bold notion. This is a very bold step, and he must be applauded for taking that step. Of course, some of you may know me from my time with the Free University of Guyana movement, where I was pushing for the University of Guyana to become free. So I'm glad to hear these things right now. And what I believe the message is that should be carried forward to students is you should try your very best to get an education. If you're someone who's interested in the University of Guyana, try and get a University of Guyana education so you can position yourself to benefit from the oil and gas economy. I think it's a great idea for you to get an education, for you to learn and to grow and to build your CV, to build your qualifications. Of course, in Guyana, less than 3% of the population has a bachelor's degree. Can you believe that? In the US and other developed countries, it's over 30%. I believe in Trinidad, it's over 20%. Less than 3% of Guyanese have a bachelor's degree. A master's is less than 1%. A doctorate is less than 1%. Of course, these numbers may have varied a little bit over the years, but even so, they're so ridiculously low that can you imagine that the US would have 10 times as many in terms of the percent of the population that has a bachelor's degree? In fact, the original issue that attracted me to the cause of trying to make the University of Guyana free is not that I wanted to benefit from it. I probably will never attend. It's not even that it's in the Constitution, which it is in the Constitution that it should be free. It's that the numbers were so low, 3%. One of the reasons that we have announced as a party that we were going to make the University of Guyana free, we're going to write off all student debt, and we're going to repay those who are resident who paid in cash. One of the reasons we announced this is to encourage people now to go to the University of Guyana or to go back to the University of Guyana. We want people to get qualified. We want people who are qualified to become more qualified. And we want to encourage as much as possible people to educate themselves so they can get the high-paying jobs in our economy. We're not looking for people to be getting a little 40,000 small something and everything all right. No, we want people to be getting these high-paying jobs in this oil and gas economy. We are looking at the inequality issue. We're also looking at it from the perspective that we don't want it's only foreigners who come to Guyana and are able to get the high-paying jobs. It must be Guyanese that are able to get these high-paying jobs. It must be Guyanese that are able to get a lot of these benefits. Of course, we will need some foreigners as we grow the economy, but we should not allow a situation to exist where Guyanese are not able to access these jobs because they don't have the right training. And certainly it should not be that people are not able to get that training because they have to pay for it because the University of Guyana is not free. This is not an acceptable state of affairs, and they need to remove those fees immediately. That is why the PNCR, that is why Leader Norton has said, we need to remove those fees immediately. This is the direction that the country needs to go. How can we have less than 3% of the population with a basic bachelor's degree? It's totally unacceptable. And of course, there are other institutes like the technical institutes that we need to support and we need to encourage people to go to so that they can get other types of training to be a part of the oil and gas industry and other industries that spring up across the country. It is the furthest thing from acceptable. It is the furthest thing from acceptable, viewers. The furthest thing from acceptable that Guyanese would not be able to access the high paying jobs in their own country. Can you imagine something like that? I don't often talk about Burnham, but Burnham would be turning over in his grave. Can you imagine? Even Chetty, you fight for independence for this country, and the country gets a big windfall, and the foreigners are the only people able to access the high-paying jobs. Guyana's founding fathers would be turning over in their graves. We cannot allow this to be the situation. We cannot allow this. So we are encouraging people to go and get an education, safe in the knowledge that we're going to get rid of those student loans, and if you pay cash, we're going to help you out. Safe in that knowledge, because we believe that we want the best future for Guyanese. We want Guyanese to be able to access all of this growth rather than the growth being concentrated only in the friends and family of folks in the PUP. That is not the way that we want things to be. We want everyone to be able to benefit. We don't want the PUP to be sorting out who is going to be getting what and so on amongst cronies and that sort of thing. That's not acceptable to us. Not acceptable to us. So that is why we've called for the writing off of these student loans. That's why we've called for university to be made free immediately, and why we've called for compensation for those who paid in cash that are resident in the country. Another way to even think about it is that this is an incentive for people to move back to Guyana, because if you move back and you become resident again, you could be compensated for your University of Guyana fees. So you have roughly, it depends on how much you paid, but you have roughly 5,000 US of compensation, 6,000 US of compensation just for moving back. You know, this is the way that we're thinking about this. We need to get skilled people in. We need to get Guyanese with skills in this country. We need to build the skills that exist in the country. That's the way that we believe that the country should go, the direction that we believe that the country should go, the thinking that we've got in mind of the vision for where we want Guyana to go. It is not acceptable that Guyanese are at the last rung of things with no kind of skills to be able to benefit from these jobs. So those are some interesting angles on this. We finally got a couple of slides here. Just the last two slides I want to share with you viewers, where we talk a little bit about these the auditing of Exxon's costs. That's the thing that I mentioned. I made some comments on actually in today's paper. So I've got a slide here that says Guyana is losing big by failing to implement World Bank project. So let's just throw that up on the screen there. So Guyana, yeah, there we go. So Guyana is losing big by failing to implement a World Bank project. Now the World Bank has indicated that even a small implementation of this would have huge gains. So they provided 20 million US for us to build our auditing and other management capacities for the oil and gas sector. And very little of that money has been made use of. Very little. And they're indicating that even if we slightly improve the management of our oil sector, it'll be hundreds of millions of dollars of gains. Hundreds of millions of dollars of gains if we just make a slight improvement. So what they're saying is this money is there for us. We can do it. We can improve the management of our oil sector. Now, we've not seen the government make use of this, which raises a real question. Why in the world would you not want to make use of funds available to help you to manage the oil sector better? For what reason? That's the first thing. The second thing is we've now got an audit. Viewers recall the audit time, the audit time limit had actually lapsed, and the PPP was not going to be able to audit Exxon's costs. When Exxon produces the oil, it runs up costs, and we have to audit it in order to know whether or not there are any inflated costs. There's a time frame, and that time frame had lapsed, and PPP had to go to Exxon and ask them if we could still audit the costs. Just imagine how embarrassing that is for a nation that we had to go and ask them because we had allowed this time limit to elapse. I had said previously that not auditing Exxon's costs, allowing these time frames to elapse, that should be a criminal offense. There's too much money that could be lost. We estimated that for a $9 billion cost, because that's what it costs, $9 billion US. Viewers. Can you imagine the PEP was going to allow Guyana to run up a $9 billion US bill and not check to see what was in the bill? These guys serious? One of the things we were trying to get the Guyanese to understand is around the world, you see a lot of procurement fraud and so on. That's about 10% of the price. That's the procurement fraud. 10% of $9 billion is 900 million US. And these guys are cool with the fact that that could be stolen right from under our noses. Wow. But when you see that the World Bank is providing us with money rather, that we can now use to improve governance, to check these auditing costs and so on, to check these costs, you kind of ask yourself this question. Does the PPP actually want to check this? Are they cool with all this money going on the side? Is the PPP getting a kickback or something? Who knows? The audit is the way that we can investigate and find out the truth. So we need to have an audit. But not just an audit, a good audit. Not just a rubber stamp audit that says, oh, your audit and everything is good. We need to have a proper audit which clearly indicates what exactly is going on. So we're going to wait. The results of that audit should be out in another month or so. But I'll tell you something interesting. The audit started, I believe, back in May, June. Only 4 months were allocated for this audit. This audit covers 9 billion US, and only 4 months were allocated. That means that they have to audit over $1 billion US in expenses, almost $2 billion US in expenses, every single month. You think they're going to be able to do that? I'm waiting to see. 4 months, $9 billion of expenses. My goodness. So we're waiting to see if they're actually going to be able to produce a good audit. We don't know. We'll have to see. And we previously called for Parliament to be able to scrutinize, at least in the Public Accounts Committee, scrutinize this audit. See what is in there, see that it was done in the way that it should be done, and see whether anything was missed or whether expectations were met. Because this is not $5 you're talking about. There's $900 million that it could be that was being inappropriately taken away from the government of Guyana. That's the concern. We don't know. The audit will help us to get a better sense of what is going on. But it is, just from the start, very alarming that you've got a World Bank loan for all of these funds, and it is not being used. A $20 million loan is not being used. We got one last slide here. Just the next slide, the last slide in the row. And that'll help us to close things out. All right, so some of you may say this is being paranoid. There's no way that these costs are being inflated and our oil and gas partners are good and conscientious fellows. And perhaps they are, and we don't know. We have to check. But let's look at Petrobras, which is the Brazilian oil company. Petrobras found that there was an inflation of prices, right? So the same costs, that was about 3% across various contracts. And do you know how much was actually lost due to this inflation of costs? $2.1 billion was lost due to this inflation of costs, viewers. So right next door, right in Brazil, you have to go across the world. Right in Brazil, they lost 2.1 billion US. So when we say that we're concerned that as much as 900 million US may be going by the wayside, it's not some crazy concern. It is a very reasonable concern. $2.1 billion right next door. Viewers, we've got to learn from other oil and gas economies. We've got to understand oil the way that we understand bauxite, the way that we understand rice, the way that we understand sugar, the way that we understand shrimp, the way that we understand timber. We've got to understand oil, and oil is its own creature. Oil money can lead to good things, but it can also lead to bad things. It has its own challenges. Right next door to us, they lost over 2 billion US due to people inflating costs. And we here in Guyana were about to let a $9 billion bill pass without checking what was in the bill. These guys are unbelievable, viewers. Unbelievable. So viewers, we've covered some interesting topics related to oil, related to debt tonight. We've talked about Venezuela on one side of us. We've talked about Brazil on the other side of us. Viewers, we're not using examples from far off. We're using examples from right next door to help you to understand that this is not an abstract worry, an abstract concern. Guyana's debt and managing Guyana's debt the way that it should be managed, managing our oil revenues the way it should be managed, is not some abstract worry that nobody should really have at the back of their mind. Auditing Exxon's costs, making sure that there has not been any theft of the resources, is not an abstract idea that somebody just has because they're paranoid. It is literally a concern we have had on one side of our borders in Brazil and on the other side of our borders in Venezuela. It is right next door. We've got to understand that we are an oil and gas economy, and we have to think the way that people in an oil and gas economy think to assess the dangers, the risks, and the new challenges that we'll be facing going forward in this economy. I want to thank you as always for tuning in to the Lowdown. Thank you as always. It's good to be on with you. It's always fun. It's always interesting. Of course, I do have a bit of a dark sense of humor, but viewers, it's always good to be with you, and thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you again on Tuesday.
Thank you for watching our program. See you right back here, same place, same time. And remember, hold the line of battle, comrades. Our victory is sure.